Hello and welcome to part 3 of this 3-part series on diseases of the nervous system. And we're going to wrap this lecture up with these last few slides here, so let's get started. So here we're going to talk about the rabies virus, or it's a more technical Rhabdovirus, transmitted by animal bite, but also through contact. That's rare, though. Animal bite is, of course, the primary way that this virus gets transmitted. So it multiplies in skeletal muscles. So say, you got this rabid raccoon and it bites you down in your calf area. So in the muscles around there, that's where the virus is going to multiply. Travels through the peripheral nerves, up the leg, and then eventually into the cord to the brain, causing encephalitis. And it's fatal encephalitis. Without treatment, it's 100% fatal. So rabies needs to be dealt with swiftly and with much fervor because it's 100% fatal. Initial symptoms may include muscle spasms of the mouth and pharynx, and that's called hydrophobia. Not necessarily that you have a fear of water, but that you have a fear of swallowing, or you can't swallow, and so you have these spasms within that region, in the mouth and the pharynx region, and it's because it's like you can't swallow. Not that you really have a fear of it. It's not like a psychosis, but it's because of these muscle spasms. When the CNS becomes infected, the victim alternates between agitation and calm, and so you're going back and forth and back and forth. It's a mind-altering virus, basically, is what it's doing. And there are two basic types of rabies. There's furious rabies and there's paralytic rabies. With furious, the animals are restless and highly excitable. And with paralytic, they seem unaware of their surroundings, excessive salivation, and so that's where we have like the foaming at the mouth. That's where that comes from, with this excessive dripping salivation. It's not like foaming like Alka-Seltzer or something like that, but it's a whole lot of salivation um, because that's where the viruses are. They're in the salivary glands, and it's causing this excessive salivation. And paralysis of the jaw as well. So how do we treat it? So you get rabies, what's going to happen? Series of injections, 4 or 5, depending on the brand of treatment that you're going with rabies vaccine. And you're also getting immune globulin over a 14 or a 30-day period, depending on which which brand of immune globulin the practitioner will be using. So again, like with tetanus, you're getting a vaccine and you're getting immune globulin because there's no time. You don't have time to wait for the primary response. Like I said, it takes about 2 weeks, and by then you could be dead. And so you're given the vaccine, and you're also given the immune globulin, which would be the antibodies, the anti-rabies antibodies, so that you can start fighting this infection immediately and getting rid of these viruses. So, like I said here, I said a raccoon, here's a dog, but a dog, come on. I mean, they're man's best friend. Why not have a raccoon or something like that? Which is, in this area of the country, the raccoon is the #1 carrier of the rabies virus. So what happens here is we got this. It's hard for me to say that's a dog. I love dogs. It will say it's a raccoon. Okay, he bites. It's a big raccoon. It's a raccoon that kind of looks like a dog. So the virus then enters from the salivary glands that are in this infected raccoon. And so those, because it bites you and its mouth is full of the viruses, those viruses then enter through the puncture wounds of the teeth of the rabid animal. Virus replicates then in the muscle near the bite, and so the numbers start to increase and increase and increase within the muscle fibers. And then virus moves up the peripheral nervous system into the CNS and the spinal cord. The virus ascends the spinal cord, and once it gets into the nerve tissue, it really starts to take off. It's like it's a highway for it. While it's in the skeletal muscle, it's kind of slow in its progression, but once it gets into the nerve tissue, it's like it's on a freeway, and it's got one destination, and that destination is the brain. The virus reaches the brain and causes fatal encephalitis. It's in the salivary glands as well. It can be found there. And so that's why it's through the bite, because that's where the viruses are so numerous, in the salivary glands. And then as a result of this mind-altering virus, the infected animal then has this this desire to bite, this furious rabies to bite, and then that will lead to, of course, the dissemination of the virus into the environment. So this is the virus's way of getting itself out there. So furious rabies, I got a picture of this dog here. I don't know if it has furious rabies, but I just wanted a picture of an animal that looked furious. And so that's kind of what you're going to see, growling, agitation, and of course then it goes back to calmness, but then it goes to agitation and growling and showing its teeth and so forth. And then there's these two on the right that are paralytic rabies. These two actually have it. These two dogs here. Um, the sad story, at least about the one on the bottom right, is that there were, of course, experiments that were done on dogs. Um, and they would intentionally inject them with these rabies viruses. And then they would just watch and see how it played out whenever these gruesome studies were done. And this one actually, I guess, wasn't, it was awful, but it wasn't as awful as others have been. The former Soviet Union, um, it they carried out some horrendous experiments using dogs, awful experiments with dogs, and one of them was giving them rabies and then just letting the disease run its course. And these poor animals then, of course, were tortured and exterminated and died from the disease. They just let it run till their death. But this is what happens. They just have this catatonic state where they just don't move, excessive salivation, and their eyes rolling back in their heads and so forth. So anyway, yeah, this needs to be treated or it will lead to 100% of the time fatal encephalitis. And in this region of the country where we live, we are in the raccoon belt. So the raccoons are carrying, they're the number one carrier. They're not the only one, but they're the number one carrier of the rabies virus in this region of the country. And you can see in the pie graph, raccoons account for about 37% of all cases of rabies. So there's a number of mammals that carry it, and raccoons are the predominant one, followed by the skunks, as you can see there. Arboviral encephalitis. So arbo it's not really a word, but it's a combination of two words. Arthropod, A-R, borne, B-O. Arthropod-borne viruses that belong to several viral families. So mainly mosquito-borne. So these are mosquitoes that are like the ones, they carry malaria, the malaria protozoan. They're carrying these viruses as well. So a mosquito that is not infected bites, say, an infected bird, like in the case with West Nile virus, that mosquito becomes infected, and then the infected mosquito bites a human, and then that human now has been infected with these viruses. Headache, chills, fever, mental confusion, coma, and death, and it can end in death in some cases. How do we control these arboviral diseases? We control the mosquitoes. Reduce the mosquito population. Now you've lost the vector. And because the vector is no longer around and their numbers are low, the disease won't spread. The same principle would apply to malaria. Get rid of the mosquitoes, the protozoa now no longer have their vector to travel through, and so therefore the disease would potentially be eradicated if the mosquitoes were eradicated. Number of types of arboviral encephalitis exist, including West Nile virus or West Nile encephalitis. Fungal meningitis, also called cryptococcosis, and soil fungus associated with pigeon and chicken droppings. So if you live in a metropolitan area where there are millions of pigeons within a large city, or you happen to be around a lot of chickens, these fungi will grow within these droppings. In most cases occur in urban areas, as I said, because of the dried and infected pigeon droppings. And the dried is the key because as a result of the droppings becoming dry, they can now become airborne and they can carry the fungal spores. You breathe them in, gets into the respiratory route, rarely goes beyond the lungs. So typically this is just a respiratory issue and can, of course, lead to pneumonia. But it may spread through the blood if it gets in from the lungs into the bloodstream to the central nervous system, causing meningitis, and typically only seen in those who are immunosuppressed. But if you're in a major metropolitan area of millions of people with millions of pigeons, and there's loads of their dry droppings, floating around, there are going to be a large proportion of people living in that area who are immunosuppressed. Mortality rate is pretty high. It's near 30%. And how do we treat it? Antifungal drugs. And the reason why it's got a high mortality is, especially of course because with the combination and the complications of being immunosuppressed, is because of this very thick capsule, and that thick capsule makes it pathogenic. So in this picture, what you're looking at is a very thick white capsule around basically the cell that contains the nucleic acids in the middle, in the center there. And so white blood cells are not able to phagocytize them, so it increases their pathogenicity. That's the only fungal one that I wanted to cover here. This is a protozoan one. African trypanosomiasis is a protozoan infection. It's transmitted from animals to humans by a fly called the tsetse fly, that's my American pronunciation of it. I'm not sure if in Africa how Africans would pronounce that, but it kind of looks like tsetse or tsetse fly. I don't know, but tsetse fly, we'll go with that. It's also transmitted from infected mother to fetus as well. There have been accidental lab infections where they have gotten into the bloodstream of a lab worker, and blood transfusions as well. So these little protozoans, they get into the bloodstream, and you can see them under a microscope, under a light microscope even. They're large enough to be seen with that. You don't need an electron microscope, and you can see them. They're these little wiggly, tiny little worm-like organisms that live in between and around. You can see them in and around the blood cells. Few, if any, symptoms for weeks or even years later. So you have an active infection, but it's kind of like it's what, a latent infection, but it's there, and symptoms may not appear for years after the initial infection. What happens is you have erratic sleep patterns, insomnia, coma, and death. Another name for this disease is African sleeping sickness. And the reason why is because you develop these erratic sleep patterns, you develop insomnia. It leads to great amounts of mental confusion. Even, I mean, you exhibit psychotic behavior because of your lack of sleep. You start to lose your mind. You go into a coma, and then eventually you die. Prevention, how do we stop it? Get rid of the tsetse fly. So you eliminate the vector. The protozoa can no longer be transmitted from one person to another because the tsetse fly, again, is the vector. It's the one that's transmitting it. It's getting it from one person to another, and without the tsetse fly, it can't get anywhere, and so you would that's how you would prevent this disease. Treatment, there's a drug that blocks an enzyme necessary for the parasite in order for it to reproduce and make more of themselves. And this drug is pretty effective. In fact, it was so effective they called it, in Africa, they call it the resurrection drug. Because it literally took people who they thought they were as good as dead because of this disease, and it brought them back. It brought them back to life and saved them from going further in the progression of this disease, eventually to death. And why is it so difficult to combat within the body? The parasite evades antibodies through what's called antigenic variation. And about 100,000 new cases in Africa yearly. And this is an interesting video done by TED Ed. I love TED Ed videos. My students can click on that in their PowerPoint, a hyperlink to mind-altering parasites, and it does. This one alters the mind greatly. But you can see with that antigenic variation, they're called trypanosomes, and what happens is they evade the immune system. So they come out as clone A. This is how they initially enter the body. And then after time, once you start to develop antibodies against them, clone A disappears and they develop this new clone of themselves, and we call it clone B. And in this graph here, they're showing different colors, and it's kind of like they're basically the same protozoa that's infecting the person, but it's kind of like they put on a new coat every single time. And as a result of that, the immune system it's like it's a totally new infection every single time they develop a new clone. Even though you're not being bitten again and again and again, you only need to be bitten once, and then the clone, the trypanosomes just keep changing and keep changing and keep changing till eventually the immune system is just completely worn out. It can't keep up with all these new clones. It's like I said, it's like you're getting infected again and then again and then again, and it just wears the body down. And so That's how they evade the immune system. Once you start developing antibodies against one clone, a new clone comes in and it just keeps wearing the body down. Primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. That's a mouthful. So you've got both here. You've got meningitis and encephalitis caused by this protozoan known as an amoeba. The amoeba initially infects nasal mucosa, then penetrates the brain. And it cannot infect, and this is interesting about it, unless it has direct contact with olfactory nerves. So it gets in nasal mucosa, through the mucosa, into olfactory nerves, and then from there it can get into the brain. And death is fast and furious, and oftentimes death ensues in about 24 hours. It's that fast, and so often the only way that anyone can know the cause of death is through an autopsy. So they have to look at the brain tissue under a microscope, and then they'll see the amoeba living in brain tissue. Because it's such a rapid death, and it's not like you're showing all these signs of hemorrhaging or major signs of illness. It happens so quickly, and then nobody knows exactly why or what happened. Found in stagnant water. So these amoeba they will be in stagnant water, and then children, most common victims are children, so they're swimming in these swimming holes. Maybe it's during a time of drought where the water is not flowing and moving these amoeba along in the current and keeping their numbers down, keeping them dilute. And so as a result, we have, imagine a stream that has a swimming hole, and there's not a whole lot of water running through it during the summer months when there's a drought, but the water in the swimming hole is deep enough, and so children go swimming in there. They come into contact with these amoeba, they get into to the olfactory nerve, and then it's death. Fatality is near 100%, and victim dies within a few days, and like I said, sometimes within 24 hours. And so the diagnosis then is made at autopsy. Very sad and devastating disease. But it's causing meningitis and encephalitis both. It's compounded. Transmissible Spongiform encephalopathies. These are caused by prions, and we talked about prions in a previous chapter. We looked at viruses and prions together. They're in some way related, I guess, and that they're infectious, but that's about it. But prions are definitely ones that we would consider in the nervous system because they cause encephalopathies and spongiform degeneration of the brain. That's where the spongiform part comes from, where it has it kind of puts these holes in brain tissue and it looks like a sponge. Some of the diseases, a few of them of these prion diseases are sheep scrapie. This is the animal, of course, seen in sheep, and this is how it got into the cow population in Great Britain during the mad cow disease outbreak in the mid-1990s. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is a genetic disease, and there's two different variations of Creutzfeldt-Jakob. Fatal familial insomnia is one that's genetic. Kuru, result of cannibalism, in which a tribe in Papua New Guinea practiced ritualistic cannibalism, and their deceased relative would have died from Kuru, and then they would consume their brains, thinking they were getting their deceased relative's wisdom and knowledge. But instead they were getting their prion disease, and then they would die from it. Mad cow disease, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy. The cattle ate within their feed, it had sheep parts that were infected with scrapie or a spontaneous mutation. The cause was not exactly certain, but it looks like it was because they were fed infected sheep parts and meat. But some scientists say it was a spontaneous mutation, that it was just a coincidence, but that was not necessarily the causative agent for the cows developing mad cow disease. Maybe transmissible to humans. It looks like it probably was. These prion diseases can be transmitted by ingestion, transplant, inherited, surgical instruments, and prions are very stable. They can't really be denatured, and what's awful about them is that they're infectious. So they infect normal cellular proteins and cause them to become these prion proteins, and then it just spreads from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell to the next neuron to the next neuron and so on. It's a chronic disease, continues on, progressive, and it is 100% fatal. There are no treatments, there are no cures for any of these prion diseases. None at all. And there's still much to be learned about these diseases. We don't understand them, and we don't know how to stop them. And this is what the brain tissue looks like, these spongiform lesions and holes that form in brain tissue, which shouldn't be there. They're throughout the brain tissue, and you could see that, as you can see here, under a light microscope on a slide. Okay, that's it. This ends chapter 22, Diseases of the Nervous System. And thank you for watching.